Let me thank first the organizers of this forum for inviting me to give the Sankore lecture. It's indeed an honor. And I'd like to recognize very quickly the former chairperson of the Africa Union, Her Excellency Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, and Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm to speak on the subject, the world needs a dynamic and strong Africa. The world needs a dynamic and strong Africa. Of the very many stereotypes that we have to deal with when we're telling the story of Africa, I don't think there's any as exasperating as the ones that seek to portray Africa as a stagnant, unchangeable, predictable continent. It was the 19th century German philosopher Hegel, and I'm sure we're all very familiar with his claim that Africa had no share in world history. Or his fellow European scholar, the historian Trevor Roper, who insisted that the history of Africa is simply the history of Europeans and their interventions on the continent. So the analysis of change, of transformation and progress in Africa has all too often been trapped in that Western, usually Eurocentric lens. Let me regale you with just at least one example of that. Some of us, I'm sure, are familiar with the work of the British economic historian, Angus Maddison, who is famous for his quantification of the size of economies using descriptive charts and graphs. And if you have the time and you stare long enough at those charts and focus in particular on the parts dealing with Africa, a few things will stand out. First, he describes a gradual transition from hunter-gathering to proper agriculture. But he insists that agriculture in Africa only took off when American crops were introduced into Africa. As for educational levels, he concludes, or concluded then, that Africa was a story of universal illiteracy, except in the small, inconvenient patch of Ethiopia, until the Islamic colonizers from the Middle East arrived. Thereafter, he describes a long stretch of negligible advancement, punctuated by slave trade, the European discovery of minerals and plantation crops, and then colonialism in the 19th century. In fact, in Madison's view, colonialism is what introduced dynamism into Africa. So it's not surprising then, that apart from parts of Northern Africa that he euphemistically refers to as Roman Africa, Madison's work generally portrays Africa's economic and geopolitical evolution as a static canvas with flat lines of income, capital growth, and everything flat. And if you look at his text and his charts, you would never guess in a million years that this was the same continent that saw the social, cultural, and political upheavals that marked the rise and fall of kingdoms like Kanem, Borno, Songhai, Mali, Kong, Asante, Dahomey, Yoruba, Swahili, Zulu, and Kabinda, all these various huge kingdoms. All you see are flat lines, slow curves, compressed trends, and the calculus of zeros. Zero growth, zero heights, zero scales, zero promise, zero dynamism. As a matter of fact, according to Madison, from 1 AD to 1870 AD, per capita GDP in Africa moved from $472 to $500, a progress of $28 in nearly 2,000 years. So in his view, the continent's GDP per capita only saw movement during the colonial period, by the end of which it had barely doubled. So for one if you're familiar with this conventional narrative, it's easy to become desensitized to their 20th and 21st century equivalents. According to McKinsey, for instance, over the last 3 decades, Africa's GDP per capita has increased by just 1.1%. Of course, that this level of performance is shared with India is barely mentioned. Africa's share of global macroeconomic output in key categories, such as value-added trade, is also usually presented as being stagnant, never rising above 4% or falling below 2% for decade-long stretches. And generally, in all these studies, Africa's share of global investment flows seems condemned to exhibit the same stagnant pattern. Our share of air passenger numbers are usually described as flat, share of global tourism dollars, flat, share of high-quality journal publications, flat. And I must say that while one doesn't spurn quantitative indicators or dismiss out of hand the importance of numerical measures and statistics, I think that there is something fundamentally faulty about telling the story of a whole civilization in broad sweeps, the complex social, economic, demographic, geopolitical, intellectual, and even spiritual factors that are at play in every civilization. So these narratives of stagnancy or lack of progress clearly do not reflect Africa's place in the world now, and most importantly, in the near future. For example, if we choose to fixate on Africa's share of global merchandise trade, we could very easily be blinded to the very incredible changes that are happening at the level of intra-African trade already, and we've heard quite a bit already of that from all the discussions that have taken place today. You may not notice that as much as 41% of Africa's machinery exports are traded within the continent. So also 35% of biopharmaceutical products and 30% of industrial chemicals are already being traded as a measure of intra-African trade. And there are dramatic changes, even in the available institutional tools for facilitating intra-African trade and investment flows and reducing bottlenecks. And we've heard already from the Secretary General of AFTA a moment ago. AFROCHAMPIONS, for example, has operationalized its African Trade Gateway, the ATG, which is an ecosystem of digital platforms, including the PAPS, the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, the MANSA platform, which is the Customer Due Diligence Repository, and the Trader Club, which comprises a trade information portal and a trade regulations platform as well. Or if during the pandemic, you chose to dwell on the fact that Africa had some of the lowest vaccination rates and vaccine procurement numbers, you may miss the very useful point that through the collaboration, as we've heard today also, of PanaBios and the Africa CDC, brokered by AFROCHAMPIONS, Africa also built and deployed the world's first vaccine passport. The PanaBios platform digitally connected labs and port health facilities, as well as pathogen genomic centers in 20 countries of Africa. Or if knowing Africa's historic share of the global supply of rare earth metals, and you note that it's been marginal and of course insignificant today, whilst you know, of course, that China's share exceeds 60%. That may seem like emphatic knowledge, but look closely and you realize that Africa's projected supply growth is amongst the highest in the world, and that the continent will soon account for at least 10% of output of these same rare earth metals. Besides, Africa's share of critical minerals is huge. It is today about 30% of the world's critical metal reserves, many of which, for example, cobalt, lithium, graphite, manganese, and nickel, are essential to renewable and low carbon technologies and the global value chains of processing critical minerals. And again, it may be very easy to miss the green shoots which we are seeing in the manufacturing sector, in this particular sector, in the critical mineral sector. For example, battery-grade manganese and some nickel are already being processed, along with lithium for lithium-ion batteries and vanadium electrolyte for flow batteries. And of course, we've heard already from Madam Mashile Nkosi what is going on in the manganese industry and some of the beneficiation arrangements that are going on. Also, African electric motorcycle industry is growing very fast. Companies such as Ampersand in Rwanda, Max in Nigeria, Borderwork in Uganda, ARC in Kenya, and Agility in South Africa are part of a rapidly growing African electric motorcycle industry market, which is run by mostly very young, innovative entrepreneurs who are presenting convincing business cases about this sector of the economy. And some are producing new electric motorcycles or retrofitting conventional ones with electric motors. And of course, there are several companies across the continent, such as Kira Motors in Uganda, for example, that are converting internal combustion engine buses and light trucks into electric vehicles. So these developments show that entrepreneurial, technical, and manufacturing capabilities already exist and can be scaled up with imaginative policies, with finance and infrastructure. The fact that Africa has historically been the commodity extracting destination for its colonizers in the industrialized world for generations is common knowledge. But it is perhaps more important to know that today, over 42% of African countries outside of North Africa have laws and policies banning raw export of ores and insisting on some processing or beneficiation before export. Or for that matter, that in the area of green sources of energy, in the past 5 years, there has been tremendous growth, especially in the blue and green hydrogen industry. There's so many green hydrogen projects in Africa reaching final investment decisions already. Angola, we've heard, Namibia, South Africa are already invested in green hydrogen. Namibia, just in May last year, signed a 10 billion deal with Hyphen Hydrogen Energy to continue with advanced feasibility studies towards the development of its green hydrogen plants, which when done will produce 300,000 tons of green energy annually using wind and solar, using renewable energy. Angola is set to become the first exporter of green ammonia to Germany by 2025. The full capacity of its green hydrogen plant is planned to be about 280,000 tons. South Africa is planning to produce 5 million tons of green hydrogen annually by 2040. There are so many other African countries, Egypt, Kenya, Morocco, Mauritania, that have green hydrogen production goals. So there's a lot of activity going on in that area. Again, knowing that Africa's share of global aviation has stayed at 2%, or that its share of global tourism receipts hasn't risen much from 3%, is not as useful as knowing that between 2022 and 2023, quarter by quarter growth in South African domestic tourism exceeded 30%. Or that in that growth spurt between 2005 and 2013, international tourist arrivals in sub-Saharan Africa saw an upsurge of nearly 55%, outperforming every other region. Now, this is the kind of dynamic knowledge about dynamical shifts in a dynamic continent that prepares the mind for the real opportunities that Africa holds for trade, investment, and global growth. Real insight about Africa's ongoing transformation, in my view, lies in learning to discern the patterns within the patterns, the shift from one lens to another, the powerful undercurrents bubbling beneath the surface, the dynamism that really matters. And I must say that as the world itself confronts unprecedented turbulence in the coming years, from climate change to artificial intelligence, and from some of the social blowback of a rapidly aging workforce to possibly novel zoonotic pandemics, the time has come for Africa's unique role to be better appreciated. It's already stale news that by 2050, as much as 1/4 of the planet's workforce is likely to be of African origin. of the youthful workforce in particular, as much as 42%, maybe in Africa. On this score, both history and the present trends amply bear testimony. What may not be fully appreciated is that research already shows, very reliable research, and there are 2 or 3 of them, that reliably show that leveraging on the current pace of development gains alone could translate that demographic dividend into an additional 15% in GDP volume growth. An energetic pool of youthful talent fortified with fast advancing artificial intelligence and the geoengineering edge of a world that is desperately in need of a new economic growth paradigm is an edge that the rest of the world ignores at great risk. In Nigeria, for example, between 2015 and 2019, actually between 2 recessions, we saw the emergence of 6 unicorns, tech or tech-enabled companies, valued at over $1 billion. All of those companies were founded by entrepreneurs all under the age of 35 at the time when they founded those companies. Today, there are nearly 500 active tech hubs all over Africa. Just this year, and we just heard a moment ago, the UNDP supported the $1 billion Africa Innovation Fund, which was launched at Davos in January. This is the largest facility in the world supporting the Africa innovation ecosystem. Timbuktu currently has 8 sector-specific hubs, which are designed to be Pan-African centers of excellence in their respective verticals. And the Global African Virtual Innovation Hub is planned as a vital part of the ecosystem. And a major mandate of this Pan-African effort is to fix the fragmented innovation ecosystem to enable African innovators benefit from existing and future synergies. It is also true, and I'm sure that all of us would agree, that Africa alone has the biodiversity reserves and the scale of natural capital to reverse centuries of ecological erosion and the unbridled carbon-laden industrialization of yesteryears. All that this planet all that has been inflicted on this planet by centuries of industrialization. But then 2 issues that we must take into account as we think through this point. The first is Africa's role as either the solution to the climate crisis or its nemesis. Africa is either the solution or the nemesis of the climate crisis. What does this mean? It means that some of the best research that we're seeing suggests that if Africa were to pursue the same carbon-intensive trajectory of wealthier countries to attain middle to high-income status, it will pump 9.6 million gigatons of CO2e into the atmosphere. And by 2050, we will be responsible for 75% of global emissions. Ultimately, that would make it impossible for the world to attain net zero by 2050. So the only way the world will really be able to achieve net zero by 2050 is if Africa pursues a climate-positive growth plan. Happily, the AU endorsed this new paradigm last September in Nairobi at the Africa Climate Summit. The climate-positive growth paradigm is an important paradigm for Africa, but perhaps more important for the entire world, because that really is the pathway to achieve carbon zero by 2050. And what does that paradigm mean? It means, for example, that by using renewable energy for onshore processing of the 110 million tons of bauxite to aluminum, which we currently export as raw bauxite from Africa to Europe and Asia, we can actually save between 1.3 to 1.5 gigatons of CO2e. We can actually avoid that amount of emissions annually. In fact, by aggressively deploying our renewable energy resources, Africa can actually provide clean energy to all Africans, 600 of whom currently do not have access to energy, and 150 million who have unreliable access to energy at a 30% lower cost and with over 90% lower emissions per kilowatt hour compared to the current stated policies. But to achieve the goal of climate positive growth, we need a grand bargain with the global north. What are the terms of that bargain? African countries on our part must formulate clear science-based national strategies for climate positive growth. The strategies will be linked to specific targets for net negative contributions to global emissions. We must create enabling legal and policy environments for these investments. The international community on its part will undertake to make the required investments in Africa's renewable energy and work out trade rules that will give access to favor low emissions production and facilitate the rapid development of fair and equitable carbon markets. This is the realistic win-win pathway to net zero by 2050. Clearly, then the world would need, and we all agree, that the world needs a strong, dynamic, green industrial Africa. Africa is possibly the only region that is free of the vested interest and the sunk cost mentality that has locked this planet into an ever-accelerating death spiral of climate disaster, poisoned oceans, and geopolitical deadlocks. Only an Africa that is freed from its historic marginalization can afford to lead the world down the path of genuine course correction that may well save this planet. Well, how do we get there? Statesmanship is what we badly need. Both the wealthier world and Africa require statesmen and women. It is statesmanship that will enable leaders of the wealthier world to see that self-interest of nations and regions to the exclusion or disadvantage of others simply will not work. Our world is now far too interconnected for that kind of self-centered, selfish reasoning to prevail. It is global statesmanship that will enable the recognition that Africa holds the key to global development and must be resourced to do so. So we cannot have all these long arguments about the obvious need for a rethink of the international financial architecture. A system that currently makes borrowing for Africa 8 times, sometimes, costlier than countries in other regions is simply untenable. Also, how can you fairly value Africa's GDP today without factoring in the sequestration capacity of our carbon sinks, which we are being told to preserve in the interest of global environmental safety? Who pays for the opportunity cost of not exploiting these resources in the interest of all? For Africa, we need African economic statesmen too, champions of African economic cooperation, prepared to make the selfless sacrifices that individual nations must make to be able to eat from a much bigger pie and a more lasting pie. Then in addition, Africa needs 3 things, and we've heard repeatedly today. The first is collaboration. The second is collaboration. The third is collaboration. Our strength lies in our ability to work together. Intra-African trade, intra-African infrastructure, intra-African thinking. We have to think together and work together, especially on trade negotiations with the regional blocs of the world. A fragmented Africa is a disaster for Africa and surely cannot benefit the world. Certainly, the world needs a very dynamic and a united Africa. Thank you very much.